So this is a study that came out in the Journal of Child Abuse and Neglect, the February 2024 issue, by a group from the University of Calgary in the Department of Psychiatry. And the title is Routine Screening for Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs, Still Doesn't Make Sense. And this is a juicy one. This juicy. Yeah, it really is. We actually were talking about maybe we want to do a whole webinar just on the ideas presented in this paper because it's really, really important to make sure that we're being critical. Hopefully the ACEs Aware and other ACEs screening programs will end up being great interventions that do a lot of good. However, we don't know that still. And so it's really, really important to ask critical questions and to make sure that these programs are being evaluated and to think through some of the biases. So this paper does an amazing job of highlighting all of the things that we need to be critically thinking about before we implement screening interventions. So a few highlights, just being that they're really calling for randomized control trials. So this would be where they have a population of patients who've consented to be a part of the study that some of them are receiving the ACEs screening and some of them are not. And then it's random as to whether they know which part of maybe the intervention that they're getting. And this is really kind of the gold standard in research in a lot of ways. They mention in this paper that's not often used for psychosocial interventions, but it has been. And so there is precedent on how to create a study like this. So they cited that there have been studies in the past on screening for intimate partner violence. And so they did 3 randomized controlled trials of intimate partner violence screening in 3 countries, the United States, New Zealand, and Canada, and found that none of these studies found significant positive outcomes for the screened population. And of course, there's a whole discussion that could be said as to why that is. Many, many, many reasons. Perhaps they were not given the resources, or when it comes to intimate partner violence, this is actually well known to be something that's very, very hard to turn around. Actually known in public health as being something that's once someone has gotten into a dynamic a little bit where they're used to having this sort of violence in their relationships, it can be very hard to turn that around on an individual level. So screening may not actually help. So this is a nice precedent to look at. A similar study could be designed for adverse childhood experiences screening. And since we know that it wasn't effective with this other intervention, would be really good to make sure that we're doing that for this one. So they also mentioned the potential harm from psychosocial interventions, that there is a pattern of higher rates of antisocial behavior among some youth exposed to group-based interventions under certain conditions, with peer deviancy training being one of the identified mechanisms. So again, it's a really big topic, but I think it's really important to understand that not all psychosocial interventions are proven to be safe and effective. So there can be harms from, we'll have to do a webinar.
It's a lot to unpack. It's a lot.
There's so much to unpack, yeah. But they did mention the risk of attributional bias. And so this might occur when a given condition is attributed to adverse childhood experiences exposure, yet the condition may not be a function of adverse childhood experiences. And again, there's a lot of nuance there, but it's important to understand that attributional bias exists, and you may be, it makes me think of like false past memories. Remember when that was like a whole thing of like remember this repressed memory, and then it turned out like it wasn't real. Mm-hmm. So these are when it comes to psychosocial interventions, there's just so many different ways that the brain works that are just wild. And so it can be a tough type of intervention to put into place. So if you're telling people this may be because of trauma, it could be kind of equivalent to almost like planting a false memory. So another potential risk of harm is that you might be labeling someone as at risk as a result of the screening, which is stigmatizing and may have negative mental health outcomes as a result of being labeled at risk for individuals. And then another really huge piece is that resources are limited when it comes to what we can put into place for health interventions. And so when you're allocating money in one area, typically it means you probably don't get to put it in another area. So do we know that this is the very best intervention to use with the money and resources that are available? And so it's really important that all of this be considered, given that you could actually allocate the resources in another way that could be more effective. So again, that honestly barely scratched the surface of this piece, and we'll put the links to all of these in a blog that we'll link here so that you can find them all. But that one is just so important. I probably just didn't note that, but also just certain groups being more targeted than others, such as by race. So there's so many things to think about when it comes to screening.